Welcome to anyone watching, it's Craig at mysimpit.co.uk and welcome to part 33 of the front dash build. In this video we're going to look closely at the design of the glare shield and the various indicators on top of it. Let's buckle up. The glare shield is the last main part of the front dash project to complete, and it's made up of the front dash brow that we can see on screen now with the various fire handles and fire controls, the upfront controller that we looked at and made in the last video, and then there's the various indicators for the glide slope and air-to-air refuelling. At the outset of the front dash project, when I outlined to myself the scope of it and set myself a brief to work to, that didn't entail having a full working hood. I think as time has progressed, that's something I would like to look at, but the working hood would come at a point where I've got all of the final visuals in place. So in the future there could be different monitors, multiple monitors, or some kind of projector system. But at this point now, whilst I've got just a TV screen, I'd be looking to just at this point create a placeholder for the heads-up display. So we'll come across to Fusion at this point and we'll take a bit of time to look very closely at the design of what will be that glare shield and all the other various bits that go with it. The starting point is what we've had to this point now, which is a piece of MDF 18mm thick which sits on the top of the Simpit, and this is what we've had to this point, but just as we see now, but no holes into it, just a clear sheet of wood. But now we start to add all of the various holes. I'm always keen where I can to use brass inserts, because it just means that disassembly, reassembly as many times as needed, changes in the future, doesn't mean you're pulling it apart where things were just screwed together and it's damaging the various bits of wood. So looking at this now, there will be a series of brass inserts, predominantly M4 in size, so we'll go ahead and drop those in now. And there'll also be some for an M3 size, so they're all dropped in. But what we can do to just get an idea of the number of them, we can see them suspended here. And I think to this point it's worked out that there's a total of 49 of the M4 brass inserts and there's 10 of the M3 inserts. Now as a point of reference, if we bring in the frame and the other part of that frame that builds out the profile, and it just means as we now build up and talk through the design, we can see it relative to the main fascia of the front dash. From a side point of view, we can see there's an exact 90-degree angle. In reality, the actual front dash fascia itself leans back slightly, and then this slopes back against that, and as they both slope back, this is a greater decline than this, so the actual angle here is not 90 degrees, but for simplicity of drawing and sketching out the design, we'll leave it as that. But I've factored in that there will be that that slope as it's all put together. Let's start looking at how we're going to build this up. So the first thing will be the fire handles. So there's going to be a lot of 3D printing with this. I'd expect it to run to potentially a couple of 100 hours. So you've got what's effectively a container. And with all of these, there's then the holes. So I'd bring in a couple of M4 machine screws, and this drops into the brass inserts below, give it a good connection. A micro switch, so it's a very simple design for these. An aluminium tube, a stabilizer, because as we pull this forward, we want the forward and backwards motion, but not left and right. There'll be a lid to then contain that. There's a lot of countersinks here as well, so when a machine screw goes in here to secure this lid in place, and ultimately something's then placed on top of this, it all sits flush. Right then, so we've then got the front of the handle, again another 3D print, and you've got holes here which marry up to the aluminium tube, so we can secure that in place. We've got spacers inside of this that suspend forward a little 3D print that will have an LED strip on. And then out of acrylic that will machine, there'll be the actual label at the front. But then what will be a little bit different for this, as opposed to other things that have needed the black and yellow stripe effect, is I'll actually have some, this time, rather than like a label, I'll have yellow acrylic that I'll spray paint and I'll machine into that and glue that on. I think that will give a better effect. And then alongside that, well, the good thing with this as well, following that design, it's just a simple duplication of that twice over again. Now to the side of it, there'll be a block of wood here. So that's in line with visually what you see when you look at the front dash brow. And then we can go ahead now and, yeah, just there'll be another brass insert here. As I say, I always go over the top with the brass inserts. It's just so, again, that means that when a material will be placed on top of this, that again will have a good secure fitting. And then we'll build up the other fire handles, which are identical, just different lettering on the front. We've got the right block here, and then we've got the right handle. And there we go. Now, this could have been a 3D print, but one of the reasons I wanted to go with wood was, as we can see that to this point, this item of wood here doesn't sit on top of this, it just sits against the side. And what stops this falling down currently inside the Simpit is there's a couple of brackets here and here that hold it. And I don't anticipate this will be massively heavy, and I don't think that this bracket would give way, but just in case, if that ever was to happen, if these are made out of wood, it just means that this would be supported via these instead. So it just made sense to design it in that way. And then we get to a series of other 3D prints, and I'll be doing them in a number of parts. I was looking at the print time for some of these as one whole unit, and I think it would need to be a series of parts that are then built up. So we've got this profile out to the left side here, which ultimately will have the store's jettison button in, and then this item behind it. And this is where using Fusion is brilliant, because I can even make sure when looking at it in 3D that it all fits perfectly. So I've even made this little indentation into it so it fits up nicely against this protruded area here. We've then got this back bit here, which again has the holes which will allow machine screws to drop straight through to the brass inserts. To continue this side profile with all the matching curvature. And then a few items inside, just to, as we can see that one there, we can see it highlighted through, just to start securing it all together. Machined out of acrylic, and this will be 5mm acrylic at this point. Normally I use opal 3mm, but I use 5 here because of this recess that you can see around the side, and that's where the machined yellow acrylic will then drop into that to create that effect. There'll also be this item machined out of aluminium, which can be dropped in here, and then at the rear of that, which we can't really see with that one, well, you can see it highlighted there, that'll have suspended backlighting in place. So far that's looking pretty good. Now quite some time went into designing this, and this is where it's really handy. Just like the duplication we had in a positive sense with these 3 fire handles, we've got the same with this unit over on the other side. So if we start to build that up, it's all made up of the same mirrored items. The only difference being that you've got the the toggle switch that will go here, whereas on this side it's a push button, and we've got different lettering, and then again it will be secured here. And what I've done, I've left a couple of holes here, so ultimately all of the wiring that you'll have from the switches and the backlighting can feed through here into this area. And we now start to build up the rear area. So again, we've got a number of items of MDF. This is working on a thickness of 20mm at this point. And again, in these you've got countersunk holes where we can drop in machine screws to secure this item of wood to the big sheet underneath of it. But then there will be a covering for all of this. So then we've got brass inserts that we can drop along here that will allow that to be secured to it. We have the same mirrored on the other side. A middle stretch, because when I'm looking at a sheet put across here, we want it supported. We don't want that to have any chance of sagging in the middle, particularly when you've got the weight of the upfront controller and the heads-up display on top of that. And then we've got this rear item of MDF here, and then we get to what will be at the very back. Bit of an odd looking design at a glance, but there's a reason behind that. We'll drop in a load of more brass inserts, and then we've got this final item at the back, and that's all to do with supporting the various inputs. We're going to have RJ45 sockets and PCBs running along here, and then power input points. So again, let's drop in the brass inserts, and in fact let's just take a look at those. There'll be holders for the RJ45 PCBs, and then you've got the PCBs themselves, and then you'll have 4 power input points, all 12 volts, which will feed all of the power needed to this. Also, some of the, and this ties in with the smaller M3 brass inserts, but there'll be a couple of power rails. This one here will feed all of the MOSFETs, because if we think about this, we're going to have a 12 volt LED backlighting in each of these 3, and the master caution button itself in the upfront controller. And this one here, that will be to just allow power to be fed to this item for backlighting. We'll go ahead and we'll drop in the actual MOSFETs, or something that's representative of them, and then we'll get to the point now where we'll put the main sheet that will cover this. But we can really see now the key innards of the design, that you're going to have a massive 3D prints. You're going to have obviously a gap here, so these can there's enough of a gap for these aluminium tubes to move backwards and forwards without being obstructed in any way. And then these indentations, they're effectively conduits to carry all of the various wiring through them to these PCBs here, and where needed over to this side here. And again, they can all then pass through all of these indentations into all of the rears of what will be RJ45 sockets. One of these sockets, this one here, will allow an Ethernet cable to drop down to the RS485 hub below, actually the one that's feeding the whole of the ADI panel. There's one more socket on that I'll use, and that will feed in to the upfront controller here, and the rest of them they'll all be for the keyboard encoder. The final one here will be an auxiliary one. That will just be for a spare input on the keyboard encoder should I need it for any upgrades in the future. So let's have a look at the cover that will be used. So it'll be split into 2 parts. There'll be a top cover at the front and a top cover at the back. Now my first thoughts were to do this with a thin aluminium sheet, and I've actually ordered certain items in anticipation of building this, and I had them arrive through, and I literally ordered them just at 2mm thick, but you wouldn't believe, I couldn't believe the weight of them. I literally thought I'd been sent a steel sheet. So again, it got me thinking about the weight of this. So I am now looking, I've gone back and I've increased the thickness to 3mm and said, well, and thought to myself, well, let's use acrylic. I'll use a black acrylic for this. And that'll do the job. It'll look fine, but it will certainly keep that weight down. So now we can start to build up what sits on top of that front dash brow that we see here. And let's just take a closer look at that. So the first thing will be the glide slope indicators. So again, lots of 3D prints. We've got one here, and it's using the same principle that I use for the indicators that were here and here for like gun ready and things of that nature. Well, this one's for the glide slope, so we've got the various labels we can drop in here. So that sits in what's like a pocket, so it sits flush. And then let's just have a look. So then we've got the rear of that. So this is to support 2 LEDs per label. Because I have found in the past, when I think back to the left console, I've just used 1 LED and it just doesn't cast enough of a width of light. So I found that it would be better to bring in 2. And then I've got this little contraption here, which is, I've called it an LED brace. It's really that where the back of the LEDs will be out to here, it's a way of separating the legs so we can be sure there's no connections that we don't want. So it keeps those separate and lets us connect all of the wiring together. We'll then have an outer shell to it, and let's pop the front in place. So that'll be the key part of the design, and we can see here that there's a hole at the bottom that the wiring can drop through, and these indicators left and right ultimately will be fed into an Arduino slave sitting at the back of the upfront controller, so the wiring can drop down here. This enclosure itself is attached in place here and here with screws, but then the wiring from this can go under here and come up into this area where the upfront controller will sit. So we'll go ahead now and pop the back on that completes that enclosure. And then it brings us to the upfront controller, which we obviously looked at the design and the build of that in the last video. So let's go ahead and put all of that in place. And then, and this is a great thing, positive duplication. 1 fire handle designed, duplicated twice. 1 left side profile designed and duplicated once. And these indicators can be duplicated across to the other side. The only difference just being the labels, which in this case are for the air-to-air refueling. Now, with regard to the heads-up display, I mentioned that what I'm looking for here at this stage is a placeholder. So the first thing was to look at measurements, and we can see on screen now a file that I've used to work out approximate measurements for different parts of the front dash, and from that I was able to determine what I would have as the dimensions for the hood. And then from other sources that we can see on screen now, I was able to see from a side profile how I'd want the struts and other things to look. But in terms of the anatomy of it, which is, well, what number of items would be put together to make this, I've mirrored what I've seen for the Warthog project, and we'll bring that up on screen. So in terms of, there'll be a side item here, and this will have holes at the bottom to attach it to the rear sheet, but holes at the top that can hold the struts in place. There'll be one on the other side, and then we have this side profile that we're after. Let's just bring that round for a better view. We'll have a piece of MDF that will represent the bottom bit with a cutout. Now, a slight departure from the Warthog project's use of this as his placeholder, I'll just have it'll either be a 3D print or perhaps another piece of MDF, and a recess, and it'll have a piece of LED strip, probably just with white lighting. And the idea will be that as I put in some 2mm clear acrylic here, it will run down and the end of it will touch an engraved line. So let's go ahead and drop some acrylic in here, and we can see that the backlight underneath will, when we engrave through the black paint here and reveal this white line, the opal acrylic, that will be illuminated and it will cast the light through the clear acrylic sheet. Let's go ahead and just pop the other bits in place. But it just means that what you'll have will be a representation of a hood, and there'll be a bit of lighting in it just for effect. In terms of the angle it sits at, I wanted it so, although there'll always be the look of it sloping, in reality this bit I want to be straight, and it will be, because don't forget all of this is actually, whilst we've drawn it at a 90-degree angle, this actually slopes back. So when all is done and in place, this will sit perfectly straight. So that is the design for what will be the final part of the front dash to complete the project. There will be just part of the glare shield on the sides here and here, because when this is in place there will be, you'd be able to look through from the side and see all of the internal. So there will be something, it'll most likely be a very, very thin sheet of aluminium that I can cut against a template and then mould in place to the side here. But what we can see here is a design that now we'll be beginning the process of all of the 3D prints, and as I say, I do expect that to run for several hundred hours. But in the next video we'll look to take all of these physical items which we'll have at that point and put them together, construct it and install it into the front dash frame. Thanks for watching.